Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 52 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today, we tend to think of Haiti as one of the poorest nations in the world. But did you know that in the 18th century, it was the wealthiest sugar-producing island in the Caribbean? Before Haiti became a nation, it had been San Domingue, a French colony which, much like the United States, achieved its independence from a European power by fighting a war and waging a revolution. Unlike the United States, the men and women who fought the war and waged the revolution in Saint Domingue were predominantly African and Caribbean-born slaves. In this episode, we explore the Haitian Revolution and the quest of both the United States and Saint Domingue to establish diplomatic and trade relations with each other. Our guide for this journey is Ronald Johnson, author of Diplomacy in Black and White, John Adams, Toussaint L'Ouverture, and their Atlantic World Alliance. During our exploration, Ron reveals details about the Atlantic world and the place of the United States and Saint Domingue within it during the late 1790s. Why the United States and Saint Domingue wanted to forge diplomatic ties with each other, and what relations between the United States and Saint Domingue looked like. Are you ready to explore the world of early American diplomacy and discover more about the Haitian Revolution? Let's go meet our guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today's guest is an historian at Texas State University. His research interests include diplomatic, religious, and cross-cultural early American history. Prior to becoming a professor, our guest served as a Foreign Service officer for the United States Department of State in both Luxembourg and Gabon, and he served as an analyst for the U.S. intelligence community. His first book, and the topic of today's discussion, is Diplomacy in Black and White, John Adams, Toussaint L'Ouverture, and their Atlantic World Alliance. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Ronald Johnson.
Hey, Liz. Thank you so much for having me.
Ron, before we dive into our fascinating conversation about John Adams, Toussaint L'Ouverture, and their Atlantic World Alliance, would you tell us about your work as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. State Department? What types of work did you perform in Luxembourg and Gabon?
Yes, thank you, and I'd be happy to talk about that. Being a Foreign Service officer is one of the greatest privileges of my life. I mean, being able to live abroad, speak and work in the local languages, and to experience on an everyday basis the cultures of other people was just wonderful. And all the while, I was strategizing and negotiating how to get countries to act in the best interest of the United States. And it was just a wonderful opportunity. Just to the question of what I was doing there, some of the things that I did, I happened to be in Luxembourg on 9/11. And I cannot tell you, Liz, how that dramatically changed America's position in the world on that particular day. So over the next months and years, one of the things that I worked very hard to do as a political officer in the embassy was to foster goodwill toward the United States. There was just a great amount of goodwill, if you'll remember. And we did our best as an embassy to try to continue to foster that and to build coalitions around that. Going on to Gabon, one of the things that I got personally involved in, and I have to admit, I didn't have any real background in this area, was trafficking in persons. Both in Luxembourg and Gabon, there were issues of trafficking in women and children, women in Luxembourg and children in Gabon. And it was one of just an eternal gratification on my part to try to bring to bear the good offices of the United States of America to work for those who could not help themselves. And that was just a wonderful opportunity for me.
It sounds like fascinating and challenging work.
It is both of those at the exact same time, and it was either one of those challenging or fascinating, depending on the hour of the day. One quick anecdote: when I was in Gabon, the ambassador left on a routine trip to another country, and there was a coup in that country. And so our ambassador is in the middle of a coup, and so I become like the point person for the State Department to keep them up to date on the safety and well-being of our ambassador. But while he happened to be there, just on a whim, he actually helped to negotiate the truce between the two warring sides. It was a really fascinating couple of days.
It sounds like it. Now, did your foreign service experience inform your research and writing of diplomacy in black and white in any way?
That is a really, really good question. Where the experience of having been a U.S. diplomat came to bear in the book is in those meetings, whenever two interlocutors or two parties are talking, I've had experience in being in those rooms and have an idea of what that was like. And one of the things that I just found myself gravitating to throughout the course of the research were dinners, because I recall very vividly how much happens diplomatically when two people are sitting down over dinner, over food. Food is an incredibly important part of diplomacy because it's not about the substance that's being talked about. It's about how are these two individuals relating to each other and building trust to be able to work together. And so I tried to bring that across in some of the episodes throughout the writing.
In Diplomacy in Black and White, Ron charts the journey of the United States and Saint Domingue to forge diplomatic relations with one another, and Saint Domingue was a French colony in revolt. Ron, let's dig into that story. In 1797, when your book begins, John Adams has just become the second president of the United States. Would you set the scene for us? What does the Atlantic world look like in 1797?
The atmosphere around the Atlantic world is incredibly important to the story. During that period, John Adams, in March 1797, when he takes over as second president of the United States, he is literally standing in the shadow of George Washington, who is standing behind him as he takes the oath of office. George Washington leaves off the scene, and in its wake, Great Britain and France are at war. The United States' relationships with France is deteriorating. Slavery is becoming more entrenched in the American South. There are rebellions, revolutions, slave uprising across the Caribbean. The United States is having to pay bribes to Barbary states to trade within the Mediterranean. The Atlantic world is incredibly dynamic and volatile during that period, and it's in that midst of dynamism that relationship is forged.
What was the stature or place in the world of the United States and Saint Domingue in 1797?
In 1797, in the 1790s, the United States, Americans, we believed ourselves to be a great nation. We believed ourselves to be a great people. We had, throughout the writings of the American Revolution, the United States had great ambitions for itself. But the problem in the 1790s is that we were still a new country. We were still, if I may, we were a second-tier country, and we depended on Great Britain. Our ships couldn't go anywhere in the world without being harassed or taken by Great Britain or France, and that did a great deal to our national psyche. We believed ourselves to be something, but the reality on the ground was not the same as we saw ourselves. But one thing I will say about the United States during this period, the Americans never gave up on this idea that we were going to be a great nation. We were going to be great. And Saint Domingue is going to play an important role in that step toward the people that we eventually become. Saint Domingue at this period is incredibly important to the Atlantic world economy. One of the difficulties, or one of the things I thought was very important about talking about Saint Domingue in this book is, today, when we speak of Haiti, we speak of a poor nation. We speak of poverty. We speak of disease and things of this nature. In the 1790s, Saint Domingue, particularly across the 18th century, Saint Domingue is incredibly important. It's one of the richest colonies in the Atlantic world. It produces a great deal of riches, and it is a rich colony. When it breaks out into revolution, it really throws the Atlantic world into a frantic about what is going to happen to the Caribbean economy because of that. Saint Domingue and the United States, they are equals, or relatively equals in the Atlantic world in the latter part of the 18th century. And that's important for readers to understand, is that the power dynamics between the United States and Haiti today are very different than what they were between the United States and Saint Domingue during the time of Adams and L'Ouverture.
Let's talk about the Haitian Revolution for a moment. Would you tell us when and why the revolution started?
The revolution started for a very basic reason. the people no longer wanted to be enslaved. It's really not much more philosophical than that. I mean, yes, there are a lot of philosophical thoughts and enlightenment thoughts that go into that, but at its core, this was a revolution of people who wanted to be free as human beings. And it began specifically on the night of August 21st and August 27th, 1791, around a meeting out in a bush area where enslaved people of color got together and they decided on this night, we're going to rise up and take our freedom. And from that moment, this group of individuals are going to begin to take over plantations. And as they take over each plantation, to gather the enslaved people on that plantation, and it's going to build across the northern part of the Saint Dominguan colony. And they're going to be incredibly successful, incredibly fast. And what that is going to do, I mean, I've always thought that success breeds success. And so what the success of the enslaved African people are going to do is bring in free people of color to be a part of their movement. So you're going to have this convergence of enslaved people from the north and free people of color from the south to build this revolution of color unlike anything the Atlantic world has ever seen. And it's going to spread and be incredibly successful, incredibly fast.
The story of Saint Domingue is pretty incredible because it was a slave society that revolted and cast off the shackles of slavery, so to speak. But what about Saint Domingue was special? What made its slave revolt possible? Because you look around the Caribbean and North America, and you have the slave society in the United States, where the slaves are not able to start a successful revolution. You also have the slave societies in Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, and the slaves in those societies also fail to start a revolution. So what is it about Saint Domingue and its enslaved population that allows it to be successful in starting a revolution?
That is a really, really good question, Liz, and I appreciate you asking it. Because in each of the cases you mentioned, enslaved people rise up. They rise up before the Haitian Revolution. They rise up after the Haitian Revolution. One of the aspects of Saint Domingue during the early 1790s was there were battles between the white French people of that colony that did not allow for a coalesced response in a timely fashion. When the French Revolution breaks out in 1791, the white colonial leaders of Saint Domingue are petitioning France very heavily to get more autonomy. So the white colonists on Saint Domingue are not incongruous with thinking in Paris. And so there's dissension within the ranks of white Frenchmen, which when the revolution of black people takes off, they are not able to bring together a coalition force to put down the revolution quick enough. And by the time white French people get on the same page, the revolution has really taken on a totally different life and is beyond their control.
How did Americans react to the news of the slave rebellion in Saint Domingue?
As one might imagine, the slave revolt in Saint Domingue was, for many white Americans, their worst nightmare. On just about any plantation across southern states where you have large populations of enslaved black peoples, one of the fears among white Americans was a slave uprising or massacres by black people. And this was being played out, within hundreds of miles off the American southern border. And so as reports came in the fall of 1791 about the takeover and the killings in Saint Domingue, it really sent a chill through white Americans. And George Washington was the president at the time. And it was the response of the United States government to work on behalf of white French colonials to try to put down the rebellion. What I found over the course of the 1790s is white American attitudes are going to change dramatically between 1791 and 1801, whereas in 1791 they were really afraid of the repetition of slave uprisings in the southern part of the United States. By 1801, Toussaint L'Ouverture had really gained a following within the United States. The Saint Domingue Revolution got very good press in American newspapers. I can't say that America as a whole came to embrace and support the Haitian Revolution, but the sentiments and the fears that we see in the first half of the 1790s are really not voiced by the turn of the century.
What was the attraction to forming diplomatic relations with Toussaint L'Ouverture, the leader of the slave rebellion, and his rebels? for the United States. What did the United States hope to gain with a diplomatic relationship?
One of the things that is very important to the United States in the 1790s is trade. And it has been our understanding throughout, since the last century of studying this episode, is that trade was a vital factor in American relations with Saint Domingue. And that is the case. But America had always had a very strong trading relationship with Saint Domingue prior to the Haitian Revolution. It had been it's up in the top three of our trading partners prior to the Haitian Revolution. And so that trade is very important to who we are and who we're going to be. What happens for the United States is, because we get on bad terms with France, or our relations towards the demands of France, our Congress puts an embargo on trade with Saint Domingue in retaliation against France. That ends up hurting the United States. And so one of the things we need to do as a country is to reestablish that trade. Also, Saint Domingue is very attractive to the Adams administration because it will become the only place in the Atlantic world where we are not beholden to Great Britain or France. It allows us a spot within the Atlantic world where we have influence over what is occurring. That's the only place outside of our borders during this period that we can have that kind of impact on another territory.
Saint Domingue becomes an outlet for that feeling of greatness and influence that the United States wants to exert, even just 21 years after it gains its independence.
That is what I found, Liz, that all the great things that we thought of ourselves were able to put into practice in Saint Domingue. From a military standpoint, from a political standpoint, before Saint Domingue does anything with Great Britain, they come to us and ask our views. And that will not happen anywhere else in the world for quite some time, just simply because of where we were as a nation. But because of the type of diplomacy we established in Saint Domingue, because of a very, very strong ties, people to people in Saint Domingue, the United States is truly going to be there in Saint Domingue where we believed we could be and will become in many other places.
When talking about the attraction of Saint Domingue for the United States, you mentioned trade and trade embargoes. Were the trade embargoes part of the quasi-war that the United States and France found themselves involved in by the end of Washington's administration and the beginning of Adams's administration?
Yes, so the quasi-war is really important to the course of this story. And for many decades, the way we talked about Saint Domingue was strictly within the confines of the quasi-war, as if it was somehow just a part of the quasi-war. What happens between the United States and France is there's a rupture of relations over our understanding of treaties that we made some 20 years before. Now, just very briefly, when we began the American Revolution, we needed a very strong ally to defeat the British. And France provided us with that alliance. And we're going to conclude two treaties with France in 1798, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, and then, more important for our discussion, is the Treaty of Alliance, which states that if Great Britain and France go to war, that the United States will support France. Well, in 1793, during George Washington's administration, Great Britain and France go to war, and George Washington declares neutrality, that he will not lead the United States into the war on the side of Great Britain or France. And for France, that is a betrayal of what they interpreted the treaty to be. And so, ergo, these deteriorating relations that really bring on hostilities that come right up to the point of war. And that's why we called it the quasi-war. Really what it was a war on the seas where France would take our ships, we would take France's ships. There was very little to any bloodshed, but we're going to raise an army. And at the time, the United States was incredibly averse to standing armies, but in the event of a war with France, we began to raise a standing army in the United States. John Adams creates the Department of the Navy and really ramps up our naval operations in preparations for this war that, thankfully, for the United States, never came. And that's why we continue to refer to it as the quasi-war.
We've discussed the advantages that the United States hoped to get out of its diplomatic relationship with Saint Domingue. But what advantages did Toussaint L'Ouverture and the people of Saint Domingue hope to get out of their relationship with the United States?
For Saint Domingue, the relationship with the United States was vital. By 1797, The revolution was in its sixth year by the time Louverture contacts the United States to kind of begin the process of developing our relations. It's in its seventh year, and the economy of Saint Domingue had been built on sugar. It was one of the world's best producing sugar islands, and sugar was a very profitable cash crop during this period. During this revolution, sugar production is going to plummet. Fields are going to go untended because by 1798, the enslaved peoples have gained their freedom. They are emancipated, so they're no longer enslaved, so they no longer want to work on the slave plantations, and so the economy is in dire straits. And Louverture, who becomes the head of the Haitian Revolutionary armies in the same year that Adams is inaugurated as president, he had a very difficult time keeping the territory together. He can't pay the troops. He can't pay servants. He can't keep the economy afloat. France will not trade with him. Britain is slow to trade with him, so he has no way of keeping his colony together. And it's very vital for a military commander to pay the troops, because if not, the troops will rebel and overthrow that commander. History is full of that. And so when he approaches the United States at this basic level, he needs short-term funding simply so he can get through the next few months. And that's how he approaches us, and we accommodate that early on, and then we move toward larger interactions, larger treaties, and so forth. But at that time, in 1798, Louverture needed someone to help him simply maintain order through a cash inflow.
This raises two questions for me. First, it sounds like Saint Domingue didn't have any other diplomatic options. It was the United States or the empires of Europe, and the empires of Europe clearly weren't supporting them. But I can't help but wonder if Toussaint L'Ouverture and the people of Saint Domingue saw some sort of contradiction in fighting to end slavery and yet treating with the United States, which was a slave society. And the second question our discussion raises for me is, what sort of attraction did Saint Domingue have for the Americans, in that it was a country fighting for its independence from a European power, and now, all of a sudden, the Americans find themselves in a place where they might be able to help a fellow colony gain independence?
Both of those are incredibly, add a great deal of irony to the story, and I appreciate you picking up on that. In the case of Saint Domingue, as you stated in the questions, they really don't have any other options. They have to trade with some Atlantic world power, and at the time, every Atlantic world power enslaved people of color. And America became the best option because Great Britain, which is its other option, actually tried to take over Saint Domingue during this period of revolution. When the revolution takes off in 1791, France is going to send troops to try to put down the revolution. The Saint Domingues defeat the French. Spain sees the chaotic turn of events in Saint Domingue as a way to pick up territory. So Spain sends in an army. Saint Domingue defeats Spain. Great Britain sees this as an opportunity. Particularly while it's at war with France, it sees Saint Domingue as a ripe opportunity to gain territory and hurt the French. So the British send an army, and Saint Domingue defeats the British. And so the British are not the best option simply because the Saint Dominguans don't trust the British, because only months before, only a little while before, they had to defeat them and push them off their shores. But the United States cannot provide Saint Domingue with everything that it needs, but it is the one country that doesn't have any views of taking over Saint Domingue, and that's a huge plus for the United States. It's crucial to Adams' policy. Adams wants to engage, but Adams is very clear that we do not want to take over Saint Domingue, that we don't want any territorial authority over Saint Domingue, and that puts us in a great advantage over Great Britain, but we're still slaveholders as a nation. And as far as I can tell, Liz, Toussaint L'Ouverture does not seem to be bothered by that. He is incredibly pragmatic. He's an Atlantic world leader. He looks at the world from an Atlantic world perspective, and that is, I need trade, and I need political stability, and I need international allies. Those are his three primary goals. From what I can tell from his writings and from his interactions, he seemed to have no contradictions about dealing honestly and openly with white people, whereas for some of his generals, General Maurice in particular, yes, General Maurice would deal with white people in the Atlantic world, but he was very, very distrustful. And we're going to see that those kind of fears play themselves out after Toussaint L'Ouverture is gone and Dessalines and others take over, where this fear of white people or this distrust of white people comes to the fore in the first years of the independent Haiti. For the United States, it's the first republic of the Atlantic world. And this idea, I thought, when I first went into the research, I thought there's going to be a move for the United States to want to propagate its republic or an abolitionist tendency in this engagement with Saint Domingue. Those were some of my initial thoughts when I went into this project. What I found is that John Adams was anti-slavery, but he was no abolitionist. And so when he went in to establish the relationship with Saint Domingue, there was none of that. Like Toussaint L'Ouverture, John Adams was incredibly pragmatic. He needed economic stability, he needed political stability, and he needed international allies. And like Toussaint L'Ouverture, he's going to find all three of those in his counterpart. So both L'Ouverture and Adams came at this relationship from very similar positions. Adams was very clear. He understood that engaging this colony on the verge of independence could lead to the United States being a part of helping a country of black people become free. The Americans understood that from the outset, and they reckoned with that, and they saw the irony in that. However, John Adams, his Secretary of State, and his cabinet all came to the conclusion that it was in the best interest of the United States to engage Saint Domingue at this time. And if Saint Domingue becomes independent, then that was just going to be the outcome that they were going to live with, and they were going to be okay with that. And they didn't see any fears in an independent black nation. Now, this idea of spreading our Republican ideas, Rufus King, who was our minister to London at the time, he was all for that. He wanted to rid the Caribbean of any of the Atlantic empires. And so he saw Saint Domingue as a way to get rid of the British and the French and to spread this idea. He thought what America did could be replicated throughout the Caribbean nations, and that he really was a big part of that. But he was kind of a lone wolf in that. Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, who was really the architect of the Dominican American foreign policy, he is a staunch anti-slavery person. He's anti-slavery all the way through. And I thought within him I was going to find abolitionist tendencies. But even there, Liz, it is simply operating with this colony, which happens to be populated with people of color, was in the best interest of the United States. And that's what I found throughout that. At the end of the day, race was a factor in the sense that the people across the table from each other were of different races, but it never seemed to get in the way of the best policy of the day.
We've spent a lot of time setting the scene, but now that we have the context for why both the United States and Saint Domingue wanted to form diplomatic relations with each other, let us now talk about how those countries established relations. Ron, how much has diplomatic history changed in the last 225 years? You mentioned that when you were in the Foreign Service, you conducted diplomacy at the dinner table. Was this how the United States and Saint Domingue conducted diplomacy in the 1790s?
It really did start over dinner. So Toussaint L'Ouverture, in the latter part of 1798, and a year and a half into his governorship and a year and a half into John Adams' presidency, he sends a emissary, a white Frenchman married to a black woman. He sends him with a letter to the President of the United States to Philadelphia, which is our capital at the time, and the emissary is invited to dinner by the Secretary of State. And over this dinner, along with some key representatives from the Congress, they begin to hash out how Dominican-American relations can proceed. And you can imagine this is a very bold move, and it takes a great deal of skill, and all of the ironies that we've discussed already has to be hashed out and ironed out before this policy can move forward. But once this group at the dinner table decide this is what we want to take to the president and move forward, then Timothy Pickering takes the emissary, Joseph Bunel, Toussaint L'Ouverture's emissary from Saint Domingue. He takes him to the president's house. And the president meets with him first in his office, and then John Adams invites Joseph Bunel back to dinner at the president's house. And it's from this dinner that Dominican-American relations proceeds But these dinners are key. And just while we're on the subject of dinners, there's one more extraordinary dinner that occurs. There's several, but there's one I'd like to point out since we're talking about the importance of dinners. In Saint Domingue, after we have established our relations, a ship's captain, Silas Talbot, is going to sit down at the dinner table of General Moïse. I mentioned General Moïse earlier because he really doesn't trust white people. But General Moïse invites the captain of the American Naval Squadron into his home for dinner, but not just Captain Talbot, but the entire ship's officer corps sits down at dinner in Saint Domingue at the home of a black general. And for the first time in probably these white Americans' lives, they are a minority and they are the subordinates of the black people sitting at the table. This is an extraordinary moment in, I believe, American history, but particularly in Atlantic world history, when over this dinner, a plan is hashed out to conduct naval operations under the authority of Toussaint L'Ouverture. At this dinner, the Silas Talbot is going to put his squadron under the authority of a black general. And it's just an extraordinary thing that happens again over dinner. And it's not about the food, it's not about the substance, it's about people sitting down across from one another, talking to each other. And Liz, very little has changed in 200 years of diplomacy. When things happen, whether it's current day, the Iran-Washington deals or the Cuba deals, all of these things occur when people sit down and learn to trust each other. Before policy can occur, that trust is important, and that trust normally is built over time and by sitting down person to person.
You mentioned that Toussaint L'Ouverture sent a diplomat to the United States to start relations. Did the United States send a diplomat to San Domingue to forge relations there?
Did we ever? We sent a man who I believe is the linchpin to Dominican American relations. His name is Edward Stevens, and in the book I devote an entire chapter to telling us who he is, because who this man is important to what he is going to be able to accomplish in San Domingue. And I won't go through all that he is, but he's a doctor, and he's from the island of St. Croix, so he's born and raised in the Caribbean. He grows up around free people of color in St. Croix. He goes off to Edinburgh to become a physician, and eventually he's going to make his way to the United States in the early 1790s when yellow fever is a recurring epidemic throughout American cities. And when he's in Philadelphia, Edward Stevens is going to be a part of the yellow fever epidemic, and he's going to work with black nurses during these epidemics with no problem at all. So when he gets tapped by John Adams to go to the colony of Saint Domingue, he's a consul general in diplomatic terms, but his real purpose is to set up ministerial relations with Toussaint L'Ouverture. From the moment he is on the ground, Edward Stevens takes the task of building that trust with Toussaint L'Ouverture. That is what he wants to do through his entire tenure. And he does this. He establishes trust, he always conveys respect, and he is ever the subordinate. For his tenure there, which is from 1799 to 1801, he is a subordinate of this man of color. And I've tried to find another instance in American history where that occurs, where a white man of stature puts himself under the authority and is perfectly at ease with being the subordinate of a black superior. And I've not come up with one. There may be one out there. I haven't come up with it. An extraordinary moment occurs between Toussaint L'Ouverture and Edward Stevens from the very beginning of their relationship. At their first meeting, they sit down and they're talking about reopening economic ties. And Edward Stevens is talking, and having been in a room when these things occur, I have a fond affinity to this moment. The subordinates in the room, the subordinates of color in the room are hashing it out with Edward Stevens, and Toussaint L'Ouverture gets up and dismisses everybody from the room. He dismisses everybody from the room, and he and Stevens stays in the room alone together. They're at the governor's palace in Saint Domingue, and L'Ouverture reaches across and he grabs Edward Stevens' hands. They hold hands. They're sitting in a room alone, holding hands, and they come to the agreement. And L'Ouverture says to him that I will implement the things that you said as you said them. And from this moment, from this very priceless moment, and again, I've tried to find another moment like this in American racial history where two men of different colors sit down and grab each other's hands in this intimate way, and their bond is built over that moment. And from it, Edward Stevens begins to write in his letters back to the United States. They are filled with talking about Louverture's character, his leadership. Very little, if ever, does he ever mention Louverture's color. For Edward Stevens, Louverture is a man, not a black man. For Louverture, Stevens is a man, not a white man. These two men truly work together as human beings, not as two human beings of different colors. And that is the key to strong, vital, and profitable Dominican-American relations during the time of John Adams.
That's a powerful story, and as you said, Stevens and Louverture form a very tight relationship, a relationship that creates an agreement for United States-San Domingue commercial relations. Now, the Adams administration presents this agreement to Congress as the Intercourse Act. Can you tell us if there were any congressional debates over the Intercourse Act, and if there were, did they divide along the traditional lines that we think of as slave states versus free states or North versus South?
This part of the story, Liz, is why someone wants to become a historian. Because reading the annals of Congress, reading the debates that went on during this period and over this issue, over the Intercourse Act, are just absolutely gripping. I could not even read, as I read them, I couldn't stop. It's pages and pages, but I couldn't stop because within the pages of these debates, you see the issues that you just raised. Race comes up. What do we do about protecting the southern states against slave rebellions? What happens if this black nation becomes an independent nation? All of these questions are front and center in this debate, and they all come out. And you would think people from the North would be in favor of the relationship, and people of the South would be against it. That would be our traditional thinking. The way it plays out, again, is an incredible story of the ingenuity, the political ingenuity of Timothy Pickering. He had what I call a Southern strategy. Timothy Pickering used Southern slave-holding congressmen to push his message of Dominican-American relations to the Congress, and it works brilliantly. When Louverture's emissary, Brunel, gets to Philadelphia, Timothy Pickering takes him and Robert Goodloe Harper, a Southern congressman, and they go around from congressman to congressman and talk about the merits of Dominican-American relations. And this also demonstrates some of Louverture's prowess in American political nature as well, because the white Frenchman who's married to a black woman was a former slaveholder. So he can speak to the fears of slaveholders on behalf of Louverture as a slaveholder, and it works brilliantly. So what you're going to have is a very split vote when it comes up. You're going to have Northerners who both vote against and for it, and you're going to have Southerners. Actually, 16 Southerners are going to vote in favor of Dominican-American relations. The final House vote is 55 to 37, 16 of which are Southerners. And if you do the math, if the Southerners don't vote, it's now 39 to 37. That's a much closer vote than 55-37. And I'm not so sure it would have passed without those 16 Southerners being on board. And it's a phenomenal reading about how Americans dealt with race, how they dealt with the fear of slave uprisings, and what are we going to do with a nation? But at the end of the day, the U.S. Congress saw it in America's best interest to trade and open up relationships with this colony of black people. Our best interest and our place in the world and our future in the world was greater than the fears about race and slavery.
What is the legacy of the diplomacy between the United States and San Domingue? Did both countries realize the advantages that they had sought in relations?
I believe, Liz, you opened your show with, we study history, in order to have a better, brighter future. And the legacy of Dominican-American relations between John Adams and Toussaint L'Ouverture is that hostile race relations is a choice. We have two groups of people who have every reason not to work together. We have political leaders who have every reason not to work together. We have military leaders who have obvious reasons not to work together, and they choose to because both nations, both leaders, both militaries are going to be stronger because of their collaboration. And the United States had an opportunity to continue that kind of relationship, but the United States chose not to. Both nations are better because of Dominican-American relations. The United States gets the Louisiana Purchase because of this relationship. And I realize it's a very strong statement to make. And I wasn't the one that made that original statement, but I think my story, the story of Dominican-American diplomacy, demonstrates how vital the affirmation, the friendship, the alliance, and the economic contribution of the United States was to continuing and strengthening the Haitian Revolution. And for Saint Domingue, they get an independent nation, which I'm not so sure was the initial objective of the revolution, but from it and from over the course of 13 years, because of that relationship with John Adams, they're able to bolster and to establish an independent nation because of the United States. And back to an earlier question, whether or not that was our intent, that became what I think is one of the most significant legacies of Dominican-American relations under John Adams and through Toussaint L'Ouverture, was the creation of an independent nation, the Second Republic of the Atlantic world. And we had a hand in that. And I think that's something America should own and be proud of.
Let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Ron, in your opinion, what might have happened if John Adams and his administration had not forged diplomatic and commercial ties with Toussaint L'Ouverture and San Domingue? What would the outcome of the Haitian Revolution and the United States' quasi-war with France have been?
Wow, you give me a question that if these things don't happen, the only thing I can project are negative. So I'll take my best shot at it, okay? If the United States does not engage Saint Domingue, I believe Toussaint L'Ouverture would have been overthrown. He would have been overthrown, and I have very little confidence that the leaders in place at the time could have held the revolution together as long as they did to create the independent nation of Haiti. That is, again, why I think that engagement with the United States was incredibly important. Perhaps there is no Haiti. Without a Haiti, there is no Louisiana Purchase. And believe it or not, I happen to think we're in the midst of the Quadrant War. It is very possible that hostilities move beyond the quasi-war into perhaps a real war, because we're engaging our Navy around San Domingue and not on the open seas with French ships on a regular basis. And so I can only see negative things coming if that relationship does not happen. And I think the Louisiana Purchase is a big deal for the United States. And so the idea that we don't get the Louisiana Purchase and double the size of our nation in 1803 is a huge repercussion. Again, a pretty large thought, but you asked me a hypothetical, so I gave it to you.
I appreciate that. Yours is a dark answer, and we could probably spend an entire episode musing over what might have happened if the Louisiana Purchase hadn't come through.
Boy, now that'd be one. That would be a very fun topic, and if we could write about hypothetical histories, that'd be a very interesting book to write.
Yes, but we historians like to deal with facts, so we'll keep focusing on real history. Before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you are researching now? Are you going back into the congressional records that you had so much fun with?
This story has become a part of me, and I'm going to take it on to another step and another level. And the part of the story that I grabbed onto, or that's grabbed onto me, is the wife of Joseph Brunel. Her name is Marie, and she's a woman of color. And the thing about Marie Brunel that really attracted me was after the revolution, after Toussaint L'Ouverture is captured and is no longer part of the Haitian Revolution, Marie immigrates to the United States. And she is not the only one. Many well-to-do San Dominguans and Haitians are going to immigrate to the United States and choose not to ever return to their place of birth. And so that began to really strike me as interesting. And so in my current project, I'm looking at Haitian immigrants in America on the Eastern Seaboard and how their presence in the 19th century influenced American life and culture alongside their counterparts from Ireland, Germany, and Italy. So it's an immigration story about how people of another country, in this case, people of immigrants of color, helped the United States develop culturally and politically over the course of the 19th century. And I'm really, really fascinated by it. I'm looking forward to it.
That sounds fascinating. In episode 17, we talked with Francois Furstenberg about immigrants from France and Haiti who settled in the United States during the French and Haitian revolutions. But most of the immigrants we discussed were white, so I imagine yours is a very similar but very different story.
Yes, Francois' work is very influential on me, and Ashley White's work, who I believe you've had on the program as well. In both cases, there are these immigrants that they deal with, and in both cases, they're predominantly white, but many brought with them immigrants of color, and I'm going to focus on those immigrants of color and how they're going to shape American life and culture in the 19th century, yes.
Where is the best place to find more information about you, your new project, and how we can get in touch with you if we should still have questions?
I'm on Twitter at Ron A. Johnson. The Texas State University History Department website has a lot of information about me. Diplomacy in Black and White can be found at Amazon.com or any of the bookstores. And if anybody, and this is something I've loved being as a writer, and I wasn't expecting this, I wasn't ready for this, but I love it, is to get emails from readers and interested parties. And so anyone can email me at any time at rj26@txstate.edu. I love getting questions and comments from readers, and I look forward to anyone who wants to contact me about the book or anything else.
Ron, thank you for joining us today and for letting us into the world of early American diplomacy.
Thank you, Liz. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you, and I just hope the listeners enjoy our time together.
The forging of diplomatic relations between the United States and San Domingue show us that early Americans had the capacity to view and treat Black men, such as Toussaint L'Ouverture, as equals. This is not the story that we've often learned in our history classes. We often learn that most white Americans were racists and that they disliked and enslaved African and African Americans because of their different skin color. Yet Ron's research into the elaborate, multiracial diplomatic dinners between American and Haitian officials, and into the reasons why the United States, a slave society, mind you, agreed to help a slave colony fight for and achieve its independence from both France and slavery, shows us that the relationships between Black men and white men were not always defined and overshadowed by race. You can find more information about Ron, his book, Diplomacy in Black and White, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/052. Did you know that you can now listen to Ben Franklin's World through the Ben Franklin's World app? For more information, visit benfranklinsworld.com/iOS or benfranklinsworld.com/Android. My favorite feature of these apps is the ability to share your favorite episodes on Facebook and Twitter directly from the app. This makes spreading the word about Ben Franklin's World so much easier, and it helps fellow history lovers find the show. Even if you don't have the app, it would be most helpful if you would tell your friends, family members, and acquaintances about Ben Franklin's World. The best way to find a podcast is by word of mouth recommendations, and I would greatly appreciate yours because it will help us find new listeners. Just a reminder that if you are looking for new history friends, you can join the Ben Franklin's World listener community. Text BF World to 33444 or visit the website and sign up for the Franklin Gazette. Finally, if you were in charge of forging diplomatic ties with another nation, what would you serve for dinner? What dish or dishes would help someone unfamiliar with American culture better understand the United States? Email your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet them to @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.